All right, we are jumping in and going to get started with chapter one. It is probably the quickest read for the entire book and sets the stage for a lot of what you will read, what we will discuss, what we will be engaging with. So it is divided up, and the first part really talks about really introducing you to social psychology, the big ideas that have emerged from the research and the work done within the field. The role of values, which sets the stage really for the research methodology. And then also there's a little blurb on social psychology and whether or not it is just merely common sense. So as we get started, we're going to just review in general social psychology, which the three broad concepts you want to remember when we think about social psych. It is the study of how people think, so social thinking, influence each other, and relate to one another. In your text, figure 1.1 on page 4, if you have the version that I have, gives this breakdown of the various sub areas under each. These are great guideposts because the text is actually divided up and organized like this. So, social thinking, we start with next chapter, the self and the social world. So how we perceive ourselves, how we perceive ourselves in relationship to others, what we believe, the judgments that we make, and our attitudes. And then we move into social influences where we talk about culture and pressures regarding conformity, persuasion, which is a really great chapter and actually sets the stage for your group assignments. And then one of the final chapters that we talk about is, I think it's chapter 8. Chapter 8 is group influences, and we talk about how people behave and function and the impact of groups to our social behavior. And then we move into topics that are relating more to variables that we study as it relates to how people relate to each other. So we start off with the heavy topic of prejudice, and then aggression, attraction and intimacy, and helping. Now, when we think about social psych's big ideas, Myers, that's the author for your text, organizes it in a very unique way. I shouldn't say unique, but a very interesting way. So, keeping within the three major categories within social psychology: social thinking, social influences, and social relations. The first one has to do with social thinking and the fact that we learned through the research in social psychology that essentially we create our own social realities. So, in a nutshell, we know that humans need to make sense of behavior and events. And then what happens is we then attribute the behaviors to some causes. So, there is order, predictability, and some sense of control. So, in any given situation, take for example, I'm driving on the road and interact with somebody who pulls out of the corner and almost causes me to get in an accident because, because they pull out of the corner without me, they kind of dart out of the corner. Um, I may attribute that as the person being irresponsible and rude and just a bad driver and all that entails with that. Somebody else may, see that exact situation. Maybe they're sitting in the passenger seat with me, or it happened to them. And rather than them attributing it to the person's disposition, which were the qualities that makes a person who they are, I use terms like irresponsible, bad driver, they may actually look for an explanation within the situation. So it may be, wow, I wonder what happened to that person. Are they in a rush? Are they late for something? Is there an emergency? And so their attributions are more situational. And so that is an example of how we may construct our social reality. One of the classic demonstrations of this phenomena was found in the 1951 football game demonstration. We have two Ivy League schools who are significant rivals. There was a big football game that really ended badly because there were a number of fistfights and brawls that occurred. Two psychologists, one from each of the institutions, decided that they were going to do some research on it. They took the same video, showed it to Princeton students, and then showed it to Dartmouth students. And what they found may not be a surprise because many of you have the same experience. The students who attended Princeton would have interpreted fouls and bad calls and infractions more than against, so unfair treatment essentially against themselves, or excuse me, penalties that weren't called against Dartmouth. And then the Dartmouth students found the same thing, except it was against Princeton. So basically, their own biases, their connection to the school, clouded their judgment, their ability to see and perceive. And so from that, we have this, the question remains, is there actually an objective reality? And while there may be an objective reality out there, your text says that we don't experience it because we always view it through the lens of our beliefs and values. And so these are the beliefs and values that we have about others and also ourselves. The second kind of major area that was touched upon in this part of chapter 1 is really just kind of introducing us to the importance of our intuitions. For many of you, you may not be aware of your attitudes, your values, your behaviors, and this is the class where you will be forced to stop and kind of take inventory of it. But what we have found over the years is that every behavior, every processing that occurs, there is the intentional, conscious, and deliberate thinking, and then there are the unconscious and automatic. And we don't turn either off, so they are occurring concurrently. So it is called dual processing. And, terms that you may come to associate as we continue to push through the chapters: implicit memory, heuristics, instant emotions, nonverbal communications, automatic processing. These are terms that you're going to become more familiar with. And just really, these are ways that we organize our thought processes, how we interpret. And what you want to take from this is that our social intuitions can be helpful. You would have heard many instances where people will follow your intuition. It can guide you. And sometimes that is accurate, but many times it is not. And we find, what research has found in social psych, is that humans tend to put too much stock into their intuition, as we do into our memory recollection, and it ends up being erroneous and becoming more of a problem, so sometimes perilous, more than it is helpful. So the other kind of thought from this first section as it relates to the big ideas in social psych is that social influences shape our behavior. Now, basically, we are social creatures. We have been designed from birth to interact. If you'd hear me talk about referencing my babies very often, but my little boy is 10 months, and from he was, I want to say maybe 6 weeks, a little under 2 months, you started to see where he was fully recognizing that there were people in the room and that he was interacting. And most definitely by 3 months, he was fully engaged. Like he would hold your gaze. There would be a smile if you were in front of him or if you smiled with him, that type of thing. And so we know that we have been hardwired to really connect with others. And so what we have found is that as we are social creatures, we end up responding to our immediate context because we long to connect, to belong to something, to be well thought of. And so what happens is, regardless of our attitudes, regardless of the values that we may hold, regardless of what our, natural desire, inclination, or thoughts may be, when we are placed into certain environments, these may be overridden by other things, these social influences. And so we may find that people may act differently and sometimes in direct in direct conflict to their own attitudes because they are in an environment that tells them that they may need to. We talk about informational influences, I think, maybe in chapter 7 or so. And basically, this is where we learn about the rules in social settings by kind of looking around and seeing what people do. And this is what happens. So somebody whose values may say that they respect all humans and we're all equal and that, our greatest gift to each other is to treat each other fairly, may find themselves in a group where a particular subset of another group may be treated not as nicely, and rather than them standing up for that group or not going along, they may actually just join in, maybe not explicitly speaking negatively or doing something, but going along with it and not saying that it's wrong because of the context. And so that's one example of where we see our social influences go ahead and shape our behavior. Now, while we are aware of the social influences, Myers says it this way in the text, that we are not tumbleweeds just blowing in the wind. And what that means is that while social influences are very strong, we do have our own attitudes and values. We do have our own personality dispositions that are going to impact from a broader scale how we respond, how we behave, how we act in different situations. And so those are going to be very important and considerations that we do keep in mind in social psychological research. The other thing to keep in mind is that while we are socially influenced and we do have our own attitudes and personality dispositions that do impact our behaviors, we also are biologically wired to behave in certain ways. So evolutionary psychologists would remind us that our human nature predisposes us to act in certain ways that are going to help our species to survive and reproduce. And so we are going to do and respond in ways that are going to be beneficial to our kin. And in the helping chapter, we read that one of the patterns that we see in helping is that persons are more likely to help another person if they are related to them. So if there is your cousin who's on the side of the road broken down and a stranger who's on the side of the road broken down, you are more likely to stop for your cousin than your stranger if all other things are held constant. Now, there is this concept of social neuroscience. Your text defines it, it's a lot of words, an integration of biological and social perspectives that explores the neural and psychological basis of social and emotional behaviors. So basically what that means is that for every psychological event, every thought that we have, every emotion, every behavior, there is simultaneously a biological event as our brain excuse me, areas are enabling certain behaviors, responses to occur. And so the social neuroscientists are going to be interested in social behaviors like, helping or hurting. But they also would want to understand what are the brain functions, the neural and molecular mechanisms that impact these behaviors. And so those are the biologically rooted aspects of our behaviors. And then finally, social psychology's principles are applicable in everyday life. So how to know ourselves better. We learn that just by becoming more self-aware. As you go through these chapters, you're going to find that you're more self-aware and you're going to know yourself. And I'm going to force you to think about yourself, your attitudes, your values as it relates to a number of different topics and settings. But it also has implications for human health, not so much just regular health, but particularly mental and emotional health. There are implications, again, for judicial procedures, namely jurors, and how decisions are made as it relates to convictions, and then in general for influencing of behaviors. Okay, so I am going to take a break right here so that I am cutting up our lectures, these video recordings, into smaller pieces, and we will resume with part 2 of chapter 1. Before I go, I think I would have mentioned to you, if you find yourself in a bind, you get stuck on anything, and you are unable to read through the chapter before coming to class, one way to be apprised and kind of get a good sense of what we will be discussing, and so that you aren't completely walking in blind, is to review the summing up section. So if I was to go through the summing up section as I close out, what we talked about in these couple of minutes were what social psych is, which is the scientific study of how we think about, influence, and relate to each other, and our central themes in social psych, which are how we construe our social worlds, how our social intuitions guide and sometimes deceive us, how our social behavior is shaped by other people, our attitudes, personalities, and also by our biology, and then how social psychology's principles apply to our everyday lives and to various other fields of study. See you in a bit.